Latino. What do you think of when you hear that word? Most of you think of, well, Latinos, right? Or you think of another word, Hispanic. Same here. I've used Hispanic to describe myself plenty of times. But where does it come from? Well, the origin of the word is pretty simple, coming from the Latin word for the Iberian Peninsula, Hispania, where Spain is located. But why that word? Why Hispanic? What if I told you it was an attempt at revision? I know, it sounds strange, so let me explain. How many of you have heard of the word Chicano? The dictionary defines Chicano as someone of Mexican descent living in the United States, like me. But the dictionary doesn't really tell you the full story. Back in the early 20th century, it was a slur used to put down working class Mexican Americans. And as someone of Mexican descent, I was surprised that this even existed, to be frank. In class, we often glossed over it. But it soon became a central part of a movement designed to enfranchise Mexican Americans and combat the racism that they experienced so frequently. One of the ways they did this was by wearing these big suits called zoot suits. Pretty nice suits, right? But there was just one problem: World War II. Throughout the war, they were seen as threateningly unpatriotic, and eventually, this sentiment boiled over into what's known as the Zoot Suit Riots, where people wearing these suits were beaten and dragged into the streets for their lack of patriotism. They were persecuted for just expressing themselves, for being part of this new emerging identity. Chicano began to be associated with thugs and hooligans. But soon after, many other people who themselves had experienced discrimination began to identify with the term. And as it gained momentum, it became a movement that aimed to end the second-class treatment that Mexican Americans were facing. They united under the identity of Chicano. The same word that was used to put them down was now championed as an emerging identity and used to combat and break the barriers that they faced so frequently. However, some people still saw the stigma that the word Chicano had and decided to identify as another word, Hispanic. They used Hispanic to differentiate themselves from the more vocal Chicano movement, as well as from another movement even more prevalent at the time, the Black Power movement. Now, both of these movements have many things in common. Both arose in the tumultuous times of the 60s and 70s, and both sought to reclaim words that had been previously used against them. But as the decades went on, they were seen as increasingly violent and anti-establishment by the public, and in order to differentiate themselves from both of these movements, Hispanic was preferred by some, and soon appeared on the 1980 census. And that's how I got to today, with 61% of Hispanics preferring that term, including myself. And in some respects, Hispanic is the preferable term, seeing that it covers all people of Latin American descent, rather than just Mexican Americans. But back to that word, Chicano. That word turned from a slur into, well, something amazing. In the word Chicano, people found a sense of unity, hope, and a pride for their heritage that they hadn't found before. And that change in meaning also shows a change in the attitudes of Mexican Americans at the time, from them being resigned to their second-class treatment to being part of a new burgeoning civil rights movement. And that correlation between the change in the meaning of a word and a change in attitude applies to so many other things as well, from technology to gender and sexuality, with words like broadcast and Latinx, to give an example. A modern example of this is with the word I just said, Latinx. However, among many members of the Latino community, there's some pushback against the term. Latinx is an attempt to create a gender-neutral term for those Latinos who aren't comfortable with being identified as either Latino or Latina, as they're gendered to male and female, respectively. Spanish doesn't have a neutral word like they, or really any neutral words at all for that matter, as they're all gendered to use either the male or female article, el and la, respectively. I think it's a great idea in principle, but the word itself is what causes issue with a lot of people. You see, that X sound at the end of Latinx, well, it doesn't really exist in Spanish, at least not the way that it's used in English, which is kind of a problem when the people you're trying to represent can't even pronounce the word. It also kind of implies that the entire grammatical system of Spanish is wrong as well, due to the fact that people are trying to fix it in this way that doesn't really pay any attention to the rules of Spanish. The nail in the coffin, however, is that the majority of Latinos don't want to be called Latinx. A survey shows that 2/3 of Latinos who have heard of it say that it shouldn't be used to represent them. This is partly just because it's new, of course, but also because its sound and use is foreign to most Spanish speakers who have never heard of sounds like these. It just shows how good intentions can be bad if they don't take into account the wishes of the people and the truth about how they want to be represented. I do, however, believe that this is a great step forward at promoting inclusivity in the Latino community. The fact that this word even exists shows that there's a movement to include non-binary people there, which is frankly great to see. So let's go to another example of this phenomenon. This time, the word black. I mentioned it before briefly, but I'd like to delve into the topic a little more. So let's travel back in time to the 50s and 60s. The Chicano movement was gaining momentum, but a far larger movement was also taking place at the same time, the Civil Rights Movement, which was the result of a century-long struggle for the rights that were promised after the Civil War. At the center of that struggle were the words used to address African Americans at the time. There were 4 main words and their variations. 2 of those words I will not say today because unfortunately their potency still remains and is still used to inflict pain on people every day. But the other 2, colored and black, had vastly different meanings today than they did back then. Here at school, we're shown images of the Jim Crow era, and in most of those images, you don't see black, you see colored. Colored at the time was perceived to be the more polite way to address African Americans at the time, while black was used pejoratively. However, as the civil rights movement progressed, black began to be championed as a new emerging identity as well. In it, people found a sense of unity, hope, and common struggle that people also felt in the word Chicano, and colored began to be associated with the bygone era of Jim Crow and segregation. And it just shows the impact of these movements on the words we use today. Had these movements not happened, it is very likely that words like black would have had the same use today than they did back then in the 50s and 60s. Words have been used to define things for almost forever. They're, words. Words have been used to put people down, to keep them in their place, but they've also been used, especially recently, to empower people, and they've given people hope for change. New meanings emerge from the old, and with that, new futures, new attitudes, and most importantly, the opportunity for change. We're seeing it today with new words like Latinx, to give an example, but the truth is that there's many more words just like these. If I were to include them all, this talk would be an hour long. But I encourage you to discover these words for yourselves. Words are something we gloss over and take for granted most of the time. But the truth is, some of these words are more important than you and I thought.